So I'm Brian Granger, one of the co-founders and steering council members of Project Jupyter. I've been involved since the very early days when it was just IPython. Some highlights of my research, design, and development work. I have done a range of different projects in the Python data science, scientific computing ecosystem. PyZeroMQ was one of the early things we did around IPython and Jupyter to create the what has become the Jupyter message protocol. I am a physicist by training, so I've worked some in SymPy on symbolic quantum mechanics library, and then a lot of work in IPython and Jupyter, and then more recently with Jake Vanderplas, the Altair statistical visualization library. Oops, wrong direction. My current work, spending a lot of time on Jupyter Lab, and then thinking about and talking to a lot of people about the main topic of this talk, namely enterprise usage of Jupyter, large complex organizations, and the various needs they have. One of the big emerging needs in particular is sensitive and confidential data. Governance and organizational aspects of Jupyter. As the project is growing, these questions are becoming really important, and so I'm spending a lot of time on that. Jupyter's diverse, and that's a statement of fact today, but also an aspirational thing, that we want Jupyter to become a more diverse and welcoming project, both for our core contributors as well as our users. One way that we monitor the diversity of our users, one among many, is to just look at the traffic on Google Analytics. And when I checked recently, the continent that's most represented in website visitors to Jupyter.org is now Asia. It's not North America, it's not Europe. So we have a very diverse community of users. And then also thinking a lot about financial and community sustainability. A lot of that is fundraising, but I would say in many respects it's not just fundraising, it's a lot around sort of the long-term picture and sustainable, responsible fundraising. And then I'm the one that is more or less leading Jupyter's enterprise partnership strategy right now. A bit of an outline. I want to begin by talking about the rewards and risks of adopting open source software in large organizations. Second, talk about the characteristics of effective enterprise engagement with open source. So if you're an organization, you decide, yeah, that's something we want to do, what are best practices? And in particular, I want to introduce a few mental models that are, I think, helpful in thinking about this type of engagement, best practices. And then a bit about how Jupyter as a project is evolving to address these enterprise usage cases. So something we're calling Jupyter white papers, a new initiative on sensitive and confidential data, and then enterprise deployments of Jupyter. Not really in this talk is basically everything else that you can find here at JupyterCon. I'm not going to do a deep dive into what Jupyter is, what the notebook is, or Jupyter Lab, or the amazing ways that a lot of people are using Jupyter. So just a very short overview to set the stage for this talk. So Project Jupyter exists to develop open source software, open standards, and services for interactive and reproducible computing. And the main point I want to make in terms of setting the background is what we're seeing is a phase transition right now between the historical sort of usage patterns of individuals within organizations using Jupyter in an ad hoc manner to the new world of large-scale, officially adopted Jupyter deployments within these organizations. And this is happening very quickly. A lot of organizations are doing this. Many different types of organizations. A lot of us here, even at JupyterCon, are seeing talks about the various data science platforms that cloud providers have, as well as a number of other startups. Jupyter is being used in data journalism, in academic and scientific publishing, the full range of educational contexts ranging from K-12 education, university education, as well as online education. Internal data science, machine learning, and AI teams within industry, and then large-scale scientific collaborations. And so this is an emerging new pattern that we're seeing happen very quickly in the Jupyter ecosystem. So I want to talk about 3 rewards and 3 risks of open source adoption. First, the rewards. Open source software enables disruptive innovation. When you look at the many major sort of software-driven tech revolutions that have happened over the last few decades, you'll typically find open source software and open source standards played a critical role. Some examples, the internet, Netscape, Apache HTTP server, HTML, HTTP, cloud computing. So this emerged in the mid-2000s, first with Amazon Web Services, and really Linux was the thing that made that all possible. One thing that you'll notice in the dates here, the open source projects typically were started long before the corresponding revolution that they enabled. Data science, machine learning, AI, this has sort of been going on for the last decade. Here are some dates of Python, R, ggplot2, NumPy. Again, these projects predate the sort of broad public awareness of data science and machine learning by a long time. Containerization, right? Docker, Kubernetes. Everyone right now is thinking about how do we deploy at scale using these approaches. And again, in almost all these cases, there's a time lag. Open source work begins, and then some amount of years later, that open source work leads to major changes in how we all work. An example from our own project with Jupyter and IPython. We began working on the IPython notebook back in 2005. And by the time the IPython notebook was released in 2011, we had already thrown out multiple prototypes. Right? And so this is something that we had begun working on long ago, long before sort of data science and machine learning really became something that everyone was talking about. So what does this mean? Organizations that adopt and engage with open source have a head start in innovation. Adopting open source software is like having an R&D lab with a 3 to 5 year horizon. Right? It's a way of looking into the future about what is coming next. Next, open source software enables your business or your organization to focus on its core business. Hopefully your organization does have a core product, service, or mission. Everything outside of that has the potential to be an expensive distraction. For example, if you're a financial services company, you don't want to have to build a data science platform, distributed computing system, visualization tools from scratch. Right? That is outside your core mission, and you're going to waste a lot of money if you're doing that. So if you're building a lot of things outside of your core business focus, you're moving slowly, reinventing the wheel, and spending money building things that you will eventually throw out. Open source adoption frees an organization from reinventing the wheel and lets it focus on its core mission. The third reward is open source adoption puts you in control. So typically open source projects have a rich ecosystem of flexible use and reuse built up around open source software projects. Open source software is like a Lego set. It's easy to build a set that comes with the box, with the instructions, but the building blocks can be reassembled into anything you need. With this Lego mindset, it's fast and inexpensive to build, rebuild, throw things out, combine, reuse, and extend. If you purchase software from a vendor, proprietary software, you're really at their mercy. If they don't offer the exact thing that you need, it can be extremely painful. So what are the risks of open source adoption? So the first risk is actually the same as the first reward, namely, open source software enables disruptive innovation. Why am I saying it's a risk? So leveraging open source software can give your organization a head start in innovation. However, many companies have woken up to find that their core product or service is now competing with a freely available open source software project that everyone in the world is adopting. So it's important to recognize that this aspect of open source cuts both ways, and you want to be on the right side of that cut. An important observation that we have over many years of working in this area, in these situations, situations, open source always wins. And so for each of these risks, I'm going to talk about the mitigations. The first mitigation here is don't fight it. If your organization finds itself competing with open source, embrace that and use it as an opportunity to iterate on your strategy. Second, you want to make sure you have an early signal on these things so you have time to adjust. You don't want to find out long after all of your competitors have already realized this. And last, it's particularly important in these situations to engage with open source projects in effective ways. I'll talk more about that. Next, as a risk, open source moves slowly. Remember what I said, open source is like an R&D lab with a 3 to 5 year time horizon. Another data point in the Jupyter ecosystem, Jupyter Lab is the next generation user interface that we are building for Jupyter that will replace the classic notebook. And Jupyter Lab went into a beta release in January and recently left the beta tag behind, and so it is ready for production. We started working on Jupyter Lab over 4 years ago, so very long time frames. Community consensus and decisions take time. If you have to go to market 6 months ago, open source may not be a good fit. You might find it moving too slowly. Some observations we have in working with a lot of companies that are adopting open source. It's possible in the short term for a company or an organization to hire a bunch of people and start to build something from scratch and move much more quickly than an open source project. However, in the long term, open source will dramatically outpace those small teams. And so I think it's important to recognize the sort of time frames involved. Mitigation, if your organization needs to move very quickly, it's useful to have parallel short-term and long-term strategies, where the goal of the short-term strategy is to enable you to get to market quickly, get in front of customers, and to enable you to transition to a longer-term open source strategy. And then again, it's helpful to engage with your sort of critical path open source projects in effective ways. Third risk, lack of enterprise support. The communities who build open source software typically do not offer enterprise support. Who do you call when something goes wrong Friday night at midnight? Ghostbusters. Some large open source projects have an ecosystem of vendors that fill in that gap, but certainly that is not the case for all of the open source projects. So mitigations. I think the most important one is to hire, train, and support internal experts on critical open source technologies. And then second, engage with critical open source projects in effective ways. You'll notice that this last point here is a key mitigation point in all the risks that I've talked about. And so what I want to talk about now is, what do I mean by effective engagement with open source projects? And here's where I want to introduce two mental models. The first mental model is puppies. An open source software project is like a big yard full of puppies. Puppies are amazing. Everyone loves puppies. Lots of people stop by to play with the puppies, to take them for walks, to throw the ball for them. These are like the users of the open source projects. A few people, the maintainers, live in the yard with the puppies, feed them, take care of them, pick up after them, wash them, take them to the vet, get their shots, and so on. Just to keep the existing puppies happy and healthy requires a ton of work and money. Working in a yard full of puppies is crazy. If you've ever been around 1 or 2 puppies, imagine a yard full of 1,000 puppies. It would be crazy. Contributions to an open source project are like getting more puppies. And I want to credit Brett Cannon, who's at Microsoft and a core Python contributor for this mental model. His tweet that brought up was, pull requests can be like someone trying to give you a puppy you didn't ask for. They mean well, but they can forget a puppy is a decade or more committed. So this is, I think, a useful mental model in thinking about how open source projects function. The second mental model is that of Central Park. So an open source project is like Central Park in New York City. It brings priceless value to the residents of and visitors to New York City, dramatically improving the quality of life for the park's 42 million visitors a year. It took incredibly forward-thinking and long-term investment. So most of the current 843 acres of Central Park were set aside all the way back in 1853. It's currently managed by a nonprofit organization, the Central Park Conservancy. That is a relatively new way that the park has been managed. That began, I think, in the late 80s. And the current maintenance cost today is around $80 million a year. So there's a very substantial ongoing maintenance cost associated with the park. And again, it's priceless. One, in terms of the value it provides to New York City, but second, just the valuation of the land. I looked up some stats, and raw land value in central Manhattan is around $100 million an acre. And so just the land of Central Park is around $80 billion. And today, to maintain the park, there's thousands of volunteers that work alongside hundreds of full-time employees that maintain the park. And an important part that I want to emphasize here is that any attempt by a company or another entity to try to mine the value of Central Park for themselves in an exclusive manner would quickly destroy the park. You could imagine a company saying, hey, we really like the duck pond over there, we want to put up a fence and charge admission. Right? It would be highly problematic from that perspective. So with these mental models in mind, what are some best practices? First, I want to talk about maintainers. I mean this word in a fairly generic way. In some projects, there's a very precise meaning about what a maintainer is. The maintainer of an open source project, they're the people who maintain and are ultimately responsible for the project. They don't necessarily do all the work, but they are ultimately responsible for that. They have responsibilities, decision-making. These often differ by the project's governance models in organization. Some of the activities of maintainers: governance and organizational work, releasing the software, opening, categorizing, answering, commenting on issues, mentoring junior contributors, giving talks at conferences and meetings with collaborators, reviewing other contributors' pull requests and contributions, fixing bugs, and writing new code. One of the main points that I want to make here is for the core maintainers of all the open source projects in the Jupyter ecosystem and beyond, writing new code is a very small fraction of the overall responsibilities of taking care of everything. If you want to think about the puppy analogy, writing new code is like getting new puppies. It's the easy part, right? You take a new puppy and you've got it. Taking care of the existing puppies and keeping them all happy and safe and healthy, it's a huge amount of work. It's also important to note that open source maintainers are sometimes paid, but are often volunteers. In the Jupyter ecosystem, the different parts of Jupyter typically have a small number of paid maintainers, where small sometimes is as small as one person part-time. Other parts of the project have multiple paid maintainers. For example, Jupyter Hub and Jupyter Lab each have a number of people who work on those projects more or less full-time. And then there's dozens to hundreds of volunteers around those paid maintainers. Bit of a reality check. So when I talked about open source being like a yard full of puppies, and there's thousands of puppies, in preparing the talk, I just went to these open source project GitHub repositories and took screenshots here. And the thing I want you to look at is the number of open issues and open pull requests. Right? So if you're a maintainer of scikit-learn, there are currently 618 new puppies that people want to give to you. Right? And for each of those, you've got to go and do the code review, have discussions, 618. All of these have on the order of 1,000 open issues. Just to go and look through each of those issues briefly would be a multi-day activity of multiple people. And so the load that exists on the maintainers of open source projects is massive. It's astounding. So what are some best practices? Recognize that the writing of new code is not the bottleneck in open source software projects. All of us who are maintaining open source projects, we love to write new code. And the reason that we're not doing it more is the rest of the bigger picture that is also critically important. So I think the best rule of healthy engagement of open source projects, in particular companies wanting to engage, is begin by actively supporting the maintainers of open source projects. Take time to understand the real needs of the projects. If you want your employees to actively engage and start working on the project, I'm recommending a 3-phase approach. Phase 1 is to have those employees start by helping with issues, so commenting on, helping to do triage on issues, and reviewing pull requests. This is a fantastic way to build trust and to get familiar with a project. Phase 2 would be everything in phase 1 plus starting to fix bugs. And then phase 3 was everything in phase 2 and 1 plus new features. And the key thing here is balance. So even if you have employees that are contributing to an open source project, they get trust. Once they get trust, they shouldn't just then switch to doing new features and abandon all the other work. They need to continue to participate in the other activities that take a ton of time for the entire project. We're working in Project Jupyter right now to figure out how to encode these ideas. One of the challenges is that not everyone who comes to try to contribute to an open source project is at the same level. And we want the projects to continue to be very open and welcoming to people who are contributing for the first time, at the same time trying to balance these questions. So this approach will build trust, and the maintainers will go out of their way to help you, and new features will accelerate. The thing that's frightening to me and exciting about open source, so I work a lot in Jupyter Lab, and we'll get a backlog of pull requests requiring review. And what happens when any of us allocate time to reviewing pull requests is not only do those pull requests get merged, it acts as a signal to everyone else in the project that we are open for business for new pull requests to get submitted. And it's a bit discouraging because we'll spend all day long reviewing 30 pull requests, we'll merge 30, by the end of the next day, there'll be 30 more. And this is the type of acceleration that happens when open source projects pay attention to the fact that it's not the writing of new code that's the bottleneck, right? It's all the other stuff around it. And when that other stuff is tended to, acceleration happens on those new features that everyone is interested. So a key things to avoid, I'm gonna be brutally honest here. Don't hire an open source maintainer and give them less time to work on an open source project. If you wanna hire someone who's a maintainer of an open source project, when you're interviewing, ask them, how many hours a week are you spending on open source? Don't be surprised if they give you a number that's greater than 40, right? And if you want to hire them, please give them more time, right? They already have too little time to do what they're doing. And if you hire them and give them less time, you are actively damaging the open source project that you're seeking to support. I can't emphasize this enough. We've seen this played out hundreds of times in various open source projects where contributors and maintainers are hired by a company and their time dies off and the open source project suffers dramatically. This is something we need to talk about openly and be brutally honest about. And I would say, I would encourage companies to put this in your employment contracts. So when you're hiring open source maintainers, put in the contract how much of their time can they devote to open source software. Another thing is don't mess with numbers. For example, if you tell them you can work 20% on open source, that's 1 day a week, that day of the week should not be Saturday, right? Second, don't hire a bunch of people at your company to implement a lot of new features to an open source project without supporting the existing maintainers, right? Going back to the puppy analogy, this is like saying, hey, let's get a massive truck, buy a bunch of puppies and go deliver them to the puppy yard, because everyone knows that puppies are great, right? First, you need to tend to the puppies that are there already. Better yet, make sure the existing puppies and their maintainers are happy and healthy first. So how is Jupyter evolving to address these enterprise usage cases? First, we started a new initiative called Jupyter White Papers. These are an emerging effort to encode and create our strategic initiatives and roadmaps that large enterprises are interested in. The Jupyter White Paper describes the specific and substantial areas of work that we are proposing in non-technical terms. The audience for white papers is not a technical audience. These are funders and business decision makers who are interested in engaging with the project. I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly. The foundation of Jupyter is its open community of users, contributors, and maintainers. And ultimately, this community determines the direction of the project and is responsible for its growth and health. At the same time, the sustainability and growth of the project requires the involvement of organizational and funding partners. To put it more plainly, Jupyter is a massive effort and requires millions of dollars a year of funding just to keep doing what we're already doing, right? If we want to even go beyond that and build new things, additional funding is needed. So white papers are designed to be a focal point for communication between the community and organizational and funding partners. They're a way for the project to say, here's what we'd like to build, would you like to partner with us? So this is a way for us to find the intersection between these two questions of what is the project interested in building and what are different enterprise partners and funding organizations willing to fund. I'm going to skip this. We started way late, so I'm going to compress here dramatically. We also have a new initiative, strategic initiative, and there's a number of white papers related to this around sensitive and confidential data. And the short of this is that as organizations adopt Jupyter at scale in an official capacity, they're realizing that much of their data is sensitive or confidential in some manner, whether it's governed by legal compliance frameworks such as GDPR, HIPAA, FERPA, or it's just proprietary company data. In these types of Jupyter deployments, this is becoming the norm rather than the exception, which is interesting because Jupyter has grown up in a context of open data. And in the open science context, this is something that we're really pushing hard on. So again, I'm compressing massively. I will post my slides online. So we have a couple new grants related to this and a lot of new work going into Jupyter Hub to address large-scale organizational deployments, and in particular, sensitive and confidential data with that. And then the other big growth area for us is enterprise Jupyter deployments. As we saw at the beginning, organizations are starting to deploy Jupyter with many hundreds to many thousands of users. And Jupyter Hub, which is the part of Jupyter for these organizational deployments, is really a set of building blocks that lets organizations create a deployment based on their needs. And different organizations have very different needs and constraints that include mapping complex organizational structures onto compute and data, business needs, patterns of collaborations, different organizational personas. It's not all data scientists who use Jupyter at these organizations. Furthermore, Jupyter is compute intensive and can be very expensive to deploy. So it's not uncommon to hear a user of Jupyter say, all I need is a P3 16x large instance with 8 GPUs, and those I think currently cost around 17 grand a month. So they are non-trivial from a cost perspective, which is a critical thing. So this is an emerging need for large organizations to have scalable, maintainable, secure, reliable, cost-effective, and highly customized Jupyter deployments that integrate with the rest of their data strategy. And we're currently investigating ways of serving those users, and you can look for some announcements in the coming months. So closing remarks, this is an active, ongoing area of work that we'll be developing quickly in the coming months. And if your organization is interested in talking with us further about any of these things, the Jupyter white papers, enterprise Jupyter deployments, or your broader open source strategy, please get in touch with me. My email address is here. And I should also mention, at this point, we have drafts of around 20 different white papers describing strategic initiatives that we're looking at pursuing related to different parts of the project. So there's a lot of ambitious plans we have, and we'd love to talk to all of you about those things. Thank you.